Shalom and welcome to all my brothers and sisters worldwide. I thank you so much for your time. Whatever your background is, whether Christian, Messianic, you're doing your own thing, Muslim, Jewish, I hope this presentation is in some way beneficial to you and you'll look into this further. And let's begin. We're going to be dealing with a very, very hot topic. Very hot topic. It's the case of the alleged claim of the resurrection of Jesus or Yeshua. Now, there are a lot of claims in the Christian Bible, the Greek Testament, about the resurrection of Yeshua or Jesus. And I'm going to present the facts based on the actual Gospels, historical, and the Hebrew Scriptures. What do we really have on the table to believe wholeheartedly that Jesus actually was resurrected, or Yeshua was actually resurrected physically? Now, within the faith of Israel, we have never accepted the claims of Christianity because we don't accept them because they're based on falsehood. And nothing that's believed in the Greek scriptures has anything to do with explicit, clear, and consistent scripture of Tanakh. Period. We have a clear and consistent message in Tanakh of how to attain atonement, forgiveness of sin, sacrifice, and worship of one God and no other. He is not a trinity. There is no secondary demigod. None of that. And it's explicit and clear in the Hebrew Scriptures. Period. The end. Now, Christians and missionaries will disagree and say, no. It is in your Bible. You just choose not to see it. Of course, they follow and mimic the words that Paul left behind in his lying testimonies, saying that the Jews are blinded. They can't see anything. Just like Moses. He uses the incredible statement that Moses was blinded by a veil, even though it says nothing of the sort that he was ever blinded because he had the veil over his face because of the glowing of the aura of God and the presence of Elohim when he saw him. That being said, let us begin. I'm going to give you the actual passages that are used by missionaries, Christians, Messianics, whatever the case, in Tanakh to prove that the alleged resurrection of Jesus or Yeshua is in Tanakh. And you can judge for yourself if these passages are clearly speaking about the resurrection of a dead Messiah. First one, Isaiah chapter 26, verse 19. Oh, and by the way, before I begin, what I'm going to share with you are the only passages in Tanakh that deal with anything to do with a resurrection, period. Okay? That being said, Isaiah chapter 26 verse 19 says, "Your dead will come to life, my corpses will rise. Awake and shout for joy, you who rest in the dust, for your dew is like the dew that revives vegetation, and the lifeless will be toppled to the ground." Another passage, Ezekiel chapter 37 verses 11 through 14. "He said to me, Son of man, these bones, they are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they are saying, our bones are dried out, and our hope is lost. We are doomed. Therefore prophesy and say to them, Thus says Yehovah Elohim, Behold, I am opening your graves," plural, graves, not grave, "and raising you up from your graves," plural. My people, I will bring you to the soil of Israel. Then you will know that I am Yehovah when I open your graves and when I raise you up from your graves. My people, and when I put my spirit into you and you come to life and I set you on your soil, then you will know that I, Yehovah, have spoken and I have fulfilled the word of Yehovah. Daniel chapter 12 verse 2. "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth will awaken, some for everlasting life, and those to shame and everlasting contempt. Hosea chapter 5, verses 15, and then chapter 6, verses 1 through 2. I will go and return to my place until they will acknowledge their guilt and seek my face. In their hardship they will seek me. Come, let us return to Yeshua, for he has torn and he shall heal us. He has smitten and he shall bondage us. He will heal us after 2 days, and on the third he will raise us up, and we will live before him. Again, this is speaking of the plural of Israel, the children of Israel, a literal resurrection of the dead, and a resurrection to the land of Israel, which already happened. There's more to come. There's more process to come. Psalms chapter 16, verses 8 through 11. I have set Yeshua before me always, because he is at my right hand. I shall not falter. Therefore my heart rejoices and my soul is elated. My flesh too rests in confidence, because you will not abandon my soul to the lower world, nor allow your devout one to witness destruction. You will reveal to me the path of life, the joyful fullness of your presence. There is delight at your right hand for all eternity. And finally, Isaiah chapter 25, verse 8. He will eliminate death forever, and Yeshua Elohim will erase tears from all faces. He will remove the shame of his nation from upon the entire earth, for Yeshua has spoken. This is all the passages that speak about the resurrection, period. Now you just heard what I read. You could go back and check the sources for yourself, and it will read exactly the same. The point is, it's very clear that this is not speaking about a Messiah. This is speaking about a nation, period. Now, let's go to the New Testament, the Greek scriptures. What is the timeline of the Greek scriptures? Meaning, when were these letters, these words on papyrus written out? What are the dating? A lot of people don't look into this. The earliest writings in the Christian Bible, bar none, and you can look this up. This is not my opinion. This is not a Jewish opinion. You can look this up in any scholarly Christian source, unless it's extremely conservative Christian evangelical website. The consensus is ginormous. The same consistent message. Paul was the earliest writer in the entire Greek Testament. His letters come first. Paul wrote for the first of Thessalonians. The earliest writing of Paul was written in the late 40s. He wrote from the 40s through the 50s, period. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul speaks about the resurrection of Jesus. Now, remember, he is the earliest writer. Okay, let's look at this. Paul was first in the year 55 in 1 Corinthians. Mark, according to all Christian scholars, major Christian scholars, was written in the year 70 or even dated older than that. Matthew in the 80s, so too Luke. And John was written in the year 100 or even later. Now, what is the earliest testimony? Paul, again. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, this was written approximately in the year 55, the earliest source about the resurrection. What does he say? He says that it was not a physical appearance when he appeared to him. He doesn't speak about an empty tomb, which should be striking to you, because in the book of Galatians, from chapter 1 through chapter 3, he talks about his whole experience of hearing God and Jesus speak to him. And all through he tells his whole testimony. He never reports when he spoke with the two disciples, James and Peter, that they spoke about an empty tomb. It's never mentioned in Paul's letters. And this is striking because he's the earliest writer. In Mark, the earliest gospel that we have, The earliest manuscript we have of Mark ends with the verse saying, in the last chapter of Mark, that the women were scared off and did not report a thing to anyone at all. Later on, later scribes added the final verses because they didn't like that it ended, that they told no one. There is no resurrection account. In the book of Matthew, there is only a mention of visionary appearances, like a spiritual appearance, almost like a phenomenon, where you see a vision of an appearance. Now, what's interesting is the later you go, like for example, Luke and John, they go out of their way to make the resurrection account very physical. Flesh and blood appearances, where they go out of their way to have Jesus eating food with the disciples, doubting Thomas, touching the wounds, holes in his hands. Physical. The earliest testimonies we have from Paul never mention empty tomb, never mention physical resurrection. Mark ends with no resurrection whatsoever. The women were scared and ran away. Matthew, it was a spiritual vision, not physical. And Luke and John have a physical, flesh and blood resurrection. Now it's obvious when you see that the dating, as it goes along and it gets later and later, obviously the later writers knew that these appearances or alleged appearances, resurrection of Jesus or Yeshua, would have been hailed as a hallucination, that they were just seeing things. So obviously they went out of their way to make it, no, this was not a hallucination. There's no chance of a hallucination. Let's paint Jesus as an actual physical flesh and blood resurrection. That's exactly what happened. Let's look at the different accounts from Mark through John, and let's look at the problems with the resurrection accounts in general. When was Jesus crucified? According to Mark, it was the first day of Passover. According to Matthew, first day of Passover. According to Luke, the first day of Passover. According to the Gospel of John, it was the first day before Passover. The day before Passover. Who carried the cross? In Mark, it's Simon of Cyrene. In Matthew, it's Simon of Cyrene. In Luke, it's Simon of Cyrene. And in John, it's Jesus himself, by himself. What time was Jesus crucified? In Mark, it's 9 a.m. Matthew, it doesn't say. Luke, it doesn't say. John, it says sometime in the afternoon, not the morning. What drink is offered to Jesus on the cross? Not such a big deal, but let's just put it in here. Why not? In Mark, it's wine or myrrh. Matthew, wine with gall. Luke, sour wine. And John, sour wine. Next, does Jesus accept the drink? In Mark, no. Matthew, yes. Luke, N.A. I choose not to answer. In John, yes. Two thieves are crucified alongside Jesus in the gospel accounts. Well, it depends on which one you read. Does either one acknowledge him? In Mark, no. Neither one acknowledged Jesus as being innocent whatsoever. In Matthew, no. Luke, one does stand out and says, don't pester Jesus because he is not guilty. He's basically standing up for Jesus. Only in the book of Luke. John, nowhere to be found either in the latest gospel. What were Jesus' last words? In the book of Mark, it's, my God, why have you forsaken me? In Matthew, it's, my God, why have you forsaken me again? In Luke, it's, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. In John, the latest gospel, it is finished. Next, what does the centurion say when Jesus died? In Mark, truly this man was the Son of God. In Matthew, surely he was the Son of God. In Luke, truly this man was innocent. John, nothing at all. What was written at the top of the cross? You think this is something that they wouldn't miss. Mark, the King of the Jews. In Matthew, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. In Luke, this is the King of the Jews. In John, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. 4 separate accounts. Who buried Jesus? In Mark, it's Joseph of Arimathea. Matthew as well, Joseph of Arimathea. In Luke, it's Joseph of Arimathea. In Acts 13, Luke writes that the Jewish leaders buried Jesus. In John, it's Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. It's not such a big deal, but I'm just putting it in there for variety. Who first came to the tomb where Jesus was interred? In Mark, it's Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, and Salome. In Matthew, it's Mary Magdalene and another woman named Mary, meaning who came to the empty tomb. In Luke, it was Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Joanna, and other women. In John, only Mary Magdalene. When do these women come to the tomb? When? In Mark, it's after the sun rose on Sunday morning. Matthew, as dawn approached on Sunday morning. Luke, early dawn on Sunday morning. John, very early Sunday morning while it was still dark. Was the tomb open or closed when they arrived? In Mark, the stone blocking the tomb had already been rolled away. In Matthew, the tomb was still blocked by a large stone. An angel descends from heaven and rolls it away. In Luke, the stone had already been moved. In John, the stone had already been rolled away. Who did the women first see at the tomb? In Mark, a young man sitting inside the tomb. In Matthew, an angel sitting on the rock outside the tomb. In Luke, 2 men standing inside the tomb. And in John, Mary sees no one when she comes first to the tomb. When she later returns with 2 disciples, she sees 2 angels. What are the women first told at the tomb? Mark, Jesus had risen. Tell the disciples he will be meeting them in the Galilee. In Matthew, Jesus has risen. Tell the disciples he will be meeting them in the Galilee. In Luke, they are not told that Jesus will be meeting the disciples in the Galilee and are given specific instructions to stay in Jerusalem. In John, the angels give Mary no instructions whatsoever. Jesus appears to Mary, who doesn't recognize him at first. He tells her to inform the disciples that he will be ascending to heaven, not to meet them anywhere. Do the women go to tell the disciples what they experienced? In Mark, it's a no. In Matthew, a yes. Luke, yes. John, yes. Now remember, Mark is the earliest gospel. Why no? Who do the women report to? In Mark, no one at all. Like I mentioned earlier, the earliest manuscripts of Mark say they ran away and they didn't tell anyone, for they were frightened. In Matthew, the 11 disciples. Luke, 11 disciples and other people. And in John, Simon, Peter, and another unnamed disciple. What did the disciples do in response? In Mark, nothing at all, because the women were afraid to tell anyone in the earliest manuscripts. In Matthew, they go to the Galilee to meet Jesus. In Luke, they don't believe the women. Their words seemed like nonsense. Peter, however, runs to the tomb. In John, they go to the tomb to see it for themselves, all of them. Did the woman meet Jesus before going to report to the disciples? In Mark, it's no. Matthew, yes. Luke, no. John, yes. Does Jesus appear to Mary before or after she meets with the disciples? In Mark, it's a no. Matthew, before. Luke, N.A. John, after. Is Mary allowed to touch Jesus after seeing him? In Mark, no account. Matthew, yes. Luke, yes. John, no. Did Mary recognize Jesus when he appeared to her? Mark, yes. Matthew, yes. Luke, N.A. John, no. Did Mary Magdalene tell the disciples that somebody had taken Jesus' body after she saw the empty tomb? Mark, it's a no. Matthew, no. Luke, no. John, yes. How many appearances did Jesus make after his alleged resurrection? 3 in the account of Mark, 2 in Matthew, 2 in Luke, and 4 in John. Where does Jesus first appear to his disciples? In Mark, in the countryside, possibly the Galilee. We're not sure. Matthew, the Galilee. In Luke, it's Jerusalem. And John, Jerusalem. Now, another thing that we never think about. We know that Paul was the earliest writings. Paul had a lot of influence on what became the Catholic Church. His doctrines of faith alone, not observing the Torah, that's what won over. The original followers of Yeshua who existed were led by James, Jacob. James, the brother of Jesus, led the movement for 30 years after Jesus died. That's an actual fact. They believed in the Torah. They did not believe Yeshua was God, divine, Son of God. They did not believe in the Virgin Mary. They did not believe in any of those things. They thought simply, at the very most, that he was a prophet, and he taught them to keep the Torah and to stay away from the Talmudic teachings of the Pharisees. This is what we have in historical sources. Another thing to mention that's very important is that they despised Paul. They hated Paul. And Paul hated them. I will be making a video about Paul and showing the problems between the actual real movement of Yeshua and Paul. That's a whole other presentation. But yes, even in Paul's own letters. If you don't believe me, read 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and chapter 12. He's directly attacking the disciples themselves. Very openly, very explicitly. There's many passages where he's mocking them. But the point is, Paul's accounts are the earliest. Period. No scholar disagrees with this. The 40s, 50s. He never mentions an empty tomb. You'd think this would be a great opportunity and a great spot. Why doesn't Paul mention an empty tomb or a physical resurrection? He actually has something against physical resurrection in his own accounts. He speaks about resurrection as the flesh being something abhorrent to him. He says, no, it's a spiritual body that we get. These are the teachings of Paul, the earliest teachings. Now, as we see, the Gospels are written accordingly. Mark was the earliest in the year 70, and in the 80s was Matthew and Luke. John being the latest, near 100 or later. And as we go further along through history, the alleged resurrection appearance becomes more and more physical, whereas earlier you go, it's more of a spiritual, hallucinatory resurrection. So there's obviously a lot of problems, even within the Christian text, to have great belief in the fact that Yeshua, or Jesus, actually was resurrected. And finally, the actual followers of Yeshua, the historical movement, who later became the Ebionites, had no belief in any such resurrection whatsoever. They had no belief whatsoever in any resurrection. So, that being said, I hope this presentation was helpful, and I hope you'll look into this further. Shalom.